When Tanya Tucker sat down for that interview and finally said the words out loud, you could feel the weight of decades lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't crying, she wasn't angry, she was just honest, and that honesty hit harder than any headline ever could. She admitted that Glen Campbell, the man she once called the love of her life, had knocked out her two front teeth during one of their fights, just like that. No dramatic build-up, no excuses. Just the truth, delivered with the kind of calm that only comes after years of processing pain you never thought you'd survive. But here's what shocked people the most. It wasn't the violence itself, as horrifying as that detail is. It was the way Tanya talked about it. She didn't frame Glen as a monster. She didn't paint herself as a helpless victim. Instead, she offered something far more complicated and far more real. She talked about a relationship that was equal parts devotion and destruction, where love and chaos were so tightly wound together that separating them felt impossible. She described a man who could be tender and brilliant one moment, then volatile and unrecognizable the next. And she admitted that even now, all these years later, she still carries pieces of that relationship with her. Not as scars she's ashamed of, but as proof of what she survived. The question everyone keeps asking is simple. Why now? Why, after all this time, is Tanya Tucker finally pulling back the curtain on a relationship that ended decades ago? Glen Campbell has been gone since 2017. The tabloids have moved on. The music industry has changed. So what's driving her to revisit the most painful chapter of her life and share details she's kept private for so long? The answer isn't what you'd expect. This isn't about revenge or bitterness. It's not about tearing down Glen's legacy or rewriting history to make herself look better. It's about something far more powerful. It's about a woman who spent years being defined by someone else's story, finally stepping forward to reclaim her own. Because here's the thing people forget. When Tanya Tucker and Glen Campbell were together, she wasn't just his girlfriend. She was Tanya Tucker, a chart-topping country music powerhouse who'd been performing since she was a teenager. She had her own career, her own voice, her own legacy. But somewhere along the way, all of that got overshadowed by the chaos of their relationship. The headlines stopped being about her music and started being about their drama. She became known less for her talent and more for the turbulent love affair that seemed to consume everything in its path. And for years, she lived with that. She let the world believe whatever version of the story made the most sense to them, even when it didn't reflect the full truth of what she endured. Now she's done with that. She's done letting other people control the narrative. She's done protecting a past that nearly destroyed her. And she's especially done staying silent while the world remembers Glen Campbell as nothing but a legend, without acknowledging the very real pain he caused the people closest to him. Tanya's not trying to cancel him or erase his contributions to music, but she is demanding that the full story be told. The good, the bad, and the unbearably complicated. What makes Tanya's decision to speak now even more striking is the context in which she's doing it. This isn't the 1980s anymore, when women in the music industry were expected to smile through the pain and keep their mouths shut. This is an era where conversations about addiction, power dynamics, and emotional abuse are finally being taken seriously. Tanya is using that shift to her advantage, knowing that her story won't just be dismissed as drama or bitterness. She knows people are ready to listen. And more importantly, she's finally ready to talk. But before we understand why she stayed silent for so long, we need to go back to where it all began. Because the relationship that nearly killed Tanya Tucker started with a fairy tale she never asked for. Glen Campbell wasn't just famous, he was untouchable. By the time Tanya Tucker walked into his world in the early 1980s, he'd already built an empire. Rhinestone Cowboy, Wichita Lineman, Gentle on My Mind. These weren't just songs, they were cultural landmarks. He had the kind of fame that opened every door, commanded every room, and made people forget that underneath all that polish and charm was a human being struggling with demons most people never saw. And Tanya, young and wide-eyed and deeply in love, didn't see them either. Not at first. What she saw was a man who understood the weight of the spotlight in ways no one else around her could. She'd been performing since she was 13, thrust into fame before she had the chance to understand what it would cost her. Glen had been there. He knew what it felt like to be adored by millions while feeling completely alone. That connection was instant and intoxicating. He made her feel seen. He made her feel safe. But what Tanya didn't realize, until she was already too deep to walk away, was that Glen Campbell's world wasn't built on talent and success alone. It was built on a foundation of addiction that had been crumbling for years. Hollywood in the 1980s was a different beast. Cocaine wasn't hidden in back rooms or whispered about behind closed doors. It was everywhere. Tanya herself described it as being passed around like a party favor, something so normalized that refusing it almost seemed rude. In that environment, Glen's substance abuse didn't stand out. It blended in. Everyone around him was using, so his behavior didn't raise the red flags it should have. But behind closed doors, away from the cameras and the crowds, Tanya saw a side of Glen that the world never did. She saw the mood swings, the unpredictability, the way alcohol and drugs could turn the man she loved into someone she didn't recognize. When Glen was sober, he was everything she'd fallen for. Kind, thoughtful, deeply talented. He could make her laugh until her sides hurt, and in those moments she believed they could make it work. She believed that if she just loved him hard enough, if she just stayed by his side and supported him through the worst of it, he'd find his way back to that version of himself permanently. That's the trap, though. Addiction doesn't work that way. It doesn't care how much you love someone or how hard you're willing to fight for them. It takes and takes until there's nothing left. Tanya tried everything. She tried to be the stabilizing force in his life. She tried to pull him away from the people and places that enabled his worst behavior. She even tried using with him, thinking that if she could meet him where he was, she could guide him out of it. But all that did was pull her deeper into the same darkness she was trying to save him from. She wasn't equipped for it. She was 21 years old, still figuring out who she was, and suddenly she was responsible for the emotional and physical well-being of a man twice her age who couldn't stay sober long enough to see what he was doing to her. The worst part wasn't the addiction itself. It was the hope. Every time Glen showed signs of getting better, every time he promised things would change, Tanya believed him, because she wanted to. Because loving someone means holding on to the best version of them, even when that version only shows up once in a while. But those glimpses of the man he could be made it impossible for her to see the truth of the man he actually was. And the longer she stayed, the more she lost sight of herself. When Tanya finally walked away, it wasn't because she stopped loving Glen Campbell. It was because loving him had become a death sentence she could no longer afford to serve. Memo Section 3. When the victim becomes the casualty. Tanya Tucker didn't set out to become an addict. She didn't wake up one morning and decide to throw her career away for a man who couldn't get his life together. But that's the insidious thing about codependency and addiction. You don't see it happening until you're already drowning. For Tanya, the descent was gradual. It started with trying to understand Glen's world, then trying to survive in it, and eventually trying to numb the pain of watching everything fall apart. Before she knew it, she wasn't just fighting for him anymore. She was fighting for her own life. The cocaine that had seemed like background noise in Glen's circle quickly became something far more personal for Tanya. What began as occasional use to keep up with the chaotic pace of their lifestyle turned into a crutch she leaned on when the emotional weight became unbearable. She's admitted that she wasn't prepared for how fast things spiraled. One day she was Tanya Tucker, the girl who sang Delta Dawn at 13 and became a household name. The next, she was the troubled girlfriend of a fatting superstar, losing grip on everything she'd worked for. Her record deal vanished. Her career stalled. The industry that had once celebrated her now whispered about her behind closed doors, not as a talent, but as a cautionary tale. And through it all, there was Glen, the man she loved, the man who was destroying her. The relationship had become a cycle she couldn't escape. They'd fight, sometimes violently, and she'd tell herself it was over. But then he'd apologize, or he'd have a good day, or she'd remember the version of him that made her fall in love in the first place, and she'd go back. Over and over. It's the pattern that keeps so many people trapped in toxic relationships. The highs feel just good enough to justify enduring the lows. And the lows, no matter how devastating, start to feel normal. Tanya has been open about the physical violence. The knocked-out teeth weren't an isolated incident. They were part of a larger pattern of volatility that defined their time together. But she's also been honest about her own role in the dysfunction. She said she knew how to push his buttons, that she wasn't always the passive victim in their fights. That admission is crucial because it reflects the messy reality of abusive relationships. They're rarely black and white. There's often a push and pull, a toxic dance where both people are hurting each other in different ways. That doesn't excuse what Glen did. It doesn't make the violence acceptable. But it does show the complexity of what Tanya was living through and why walking away felt impossible for so long. Her father saw what was happening before she did. He watched his daughter, once a blazing force in country music, lose herself to a man and a lifestyle that were swallowing her whole. So he did the only thing he could think of. He flew to California, confronted the chaos head-on, and physically removed Tanya from the situation. He dragged her back to Nashville, away from Glen, away from Hollywood, away from the drugs and the dysfunction. It was an intervention born out of desperation and love. And while it wasn't a magic fix, it was the beginning of her path back. But even distance couldn't erase the damage. Tanya was left to pick up the pieces of a career that had nearly collapsed and a sense of self that had been shattered. She had to reckon with the choices she'd made, the opportunities she'd lost, and the person she'd become while trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. The road to recovery wasn't about forgetting Glen or pretending the relationship never happened. It was about learning to separate the love she still felt from the reality of what that love had cost her. Tanya Tucker didn't leave because she was weak. She left because staying would have killed her. And even after she walked away, the scars remained, carved deep into her heart and her history, reminders of a love that burned too hot and left nothing but ash. For decades, Tanya Tucker carried the weight of her past with Glen Campbell in silence. It wasn't because she had nothing to say. It was because saying it out loud felt dangerous. In the music industry of the 1980s and 90s, women who spoke up about abuse or dysfunction were rarely believed. They were labeled as bitter, attention-seeking, or worse. Their careers suffered while the men they accused continued to thrive. Tanya had already lost so much during her time with Glen, her record deal. Her momentum, her sense of self. She wasn't about to risk what little she had left by becoming the woman who aired dirty laundry about a beloved icon. So she stayed quiet. She gave vague answers in interviews. She protected both his reputation and her own survival. And she buried the pain so deep that even she sometimes forgot how much it still hurt. But silence has a cost too. Every time someone praised Glen Campbell as a musical genius without acknowledging the darkness behind the legend, Tanya felt it. Every time his legacy was celebrated without mention of the people he'd hurt, she carried that burden alone. And when Glen was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, that burden grew heavier. She watched from a distance as the world mourned the slow fade of a man who had once been larger than life. She saw the tributes, the retrospectives, the outpouring of love from fans who only knew the version of Glen they'd seen on stage. And she felt the complicated ache of loving someone who had caused her so much pain, knowing she'd never get the closure or apology she deserved. When Glen died in 2017, something inside Tanya shifted. His death wasn't just the end of his life. It was the end of any possibility that they'd ever reconcile or that he'd acknowledge what happened between them. She released a tribute song called Forever Loving You shortly after his passing, and the lyrics told a story that was both tender and tragic. It wasn't a song of anger or resentment. It was a song of unfinished business, a goodbye she never got to say while he was alive. And for fans paying attention, it was the first real hint that there was far more to their story than anyone had been told. That's when Tanya realized something crucial. Glen's death had freed her in a way his life never could. She no longer had to worry about how speaking her truth would affect him or his family. She no longer had to balance loyalty with honesty. For the first time in decades, she could tell her story without fear of retaliation or judgment from the one person who'd been at the center of it all. And more importantly, the world had changed. Conversations about addiction, domestic violence, and power dynamics were finally being taken seriously. Women were being believed. Their stories were being heard. Tanya saw that shift and recognized it as her moment. So she started talking, not all at once but gradually, carefully, with the kind of measured honesty that comes from years of reflection. She didn't demonize Glen. She didn't try to destroy his legacy or turn herself into a perfect victim. Instead, she offered something far more powerful and far more real. She told the truth, the whole truth, the parts that made her look strong and the parts that made her look foolish, the moments of love and the moments of violence, the hope and the heartbreak. She gave the world a complete picture of what it's like to love someone who's battling addiction, to stay in a relationship that's destroying you, and to finally walk away even when part of you still doesn't want to. And here's what surprised fans the most. It wasn't that Tanya hated Glen Campbell. It's that she still had love for who he could have been while fully acknowledging the damage of who he actually was. She refused to simplify their story into hero and villain. She refused to let decades of pain be dismissed or romanticized. She stood in the messy middle and said, "This is what happened, and I survived it, and I'm not ashamed anymore." Tanya Tucker didn't wait decades to speak because she was scared. She waited because she needed to become strong enough to tell the truth without destroying herself in the process. And now, finally, she has. If Tanya's story hit you as hard as it hit us, don't just walk away. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Hit that like button and subscribe because we're diving deep into the untold stories that shaped country music's biggest legends. Click the next video to keep the truth coming.